Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. I want to start today's review by sending a huge thanks to channel patron Brocco Lee, also known as Hattie. Hattie's been kind enough to lend me his personal Jotunheim 2 amplifier, despite the fact that it's a brand new amp that he's probably only had for a very short time. So it's a very selfless act, very generous act, and I want to say a huge thanks to Hattie for making this review possible. If you want to share your thanks and your appreciation as well, maybe drop a note down below and thank Hattie for his generosity. The Jotunheim 2 is a $399 fully balanced amplifier from Schiit Audio. It's also a preamplifier and can even take an onboard card for either a DAC or a phono stage, so it's incredibly versatile and incredibly powerful. Whether or not it sounds good is a big question, and if you've seen my review of the original Jotunheim, you'll know that I wasn't much a fan. So I'm hoping that the Jotunheim 2 can redeem this product in my eyes, because most Schiit products I thoroughly enjoy. There's a few misses along the way of course, but for the most part I enjoy Schiit's products and I had high hopes for the Jotunheim 2. As part of this review, I've really put the Jotunheim 2 through its paces, looking at the quality of the single-ended and balanced inputs and outputs. I've also looked at it up against a number of other amplifiers, including Schiit's own Magnius and Asgard 3, but also the Geshelli Erish balanced amplifier and even the Burson Soloist that regular viewers will know I love and purchased my own unit, having reviewed it here on the channel. So there's plenty of content to come. This review might be a bit longer than usual, so strap in and come with me as we talk about the Schiit Jotunheim 2. Hey folks, sorry about the interruption, but I want to talk to you briefly about the giveaway I mentioned in the recent HiFiMan HE400 review. As the channel rapidly approaches 10,000 subscribers, I thought it might be a really good time to do a giveaway, and at roughly the same time, Andy from Melbourne Chi-Fi Audio agreed to allow me to give away the UP4 and the UA1 from Shanling that I've recently reviewed. Or at least I've recently reviewed the UP4, the UA1 review is coming soon. I can tell you up front that it's a really nice little USB dongle DAC and something that's worth having in your collection if you ever listen to music on the go from a smartphone. So with that in mind, make sure you watch through this video because there's going to be a code on the screen later on in the video that you're going to need to put down in the comments below if you want to enter the competition. So all you need to do is be a subscriber and put the code in the comments on this video and you'll automatically be in the draw for the Shanling UP4 and or the Shanling UA1. Good luck, and now let's get back to the video. Starting as always with an explanation of the design and the features of the amp.
You, baby. My life used to be in blue, now it's mostly filled with gloom. I miss you, baby. Yeah, I miss you, baby.
The Jotunheim 2 retails for $399, which translates without any shipping or anything included, just direct conversion, to about 515 Australian dollars. Now, any Aussies out there who've looked at this from online sellers in Australia will have seen a much higher price than 515 Australian dollars. I can't fully explain that because even if you added $100 or $150 for shipping, it still lands cheaper than $829. So I don't understand the pricing in Australia. I can't fully explain it. The good news is you can order direct from Schiit, and that might just be the way to go. But for now, we're going to focus this review, as I usually do, on the US dollar pricing because it makes for easier comparisons. So we've got here a $399 amplifier that's without any of the cards added. So talking about the cards, you can add to this either a Delta Sigma DAC card, a multi-bit DAC card, or a passive phono stage. Each of those slots into the amp, and you'll see a shot in a second of where that goes. It slots in and can make this an all-in-one unit that does everything you need in a single box. By all reports, the DAC cards that are built into Schiit's amplifiers are not as good as a standalone, but it's a nice convenience option if you want it. Because this hasn't got the built-in DAC card, I'm not going to talk about the add-on cards, I'm just going to talk about the performance of the Jotunheim 2 as an amp. The Jotunheim here is also obscenely powerful, being able to pump out a maximum of 7.5 watts in balanced mode or 2.5 watts single-ended. Even with a 600 ohm load, it's still putting out 600 milliwatts through the balanced outputs, but it does drop down to 165 milliwatts through single-ended. So there's quite a big difference between the balanced and the single-ended power outputs, but realistically, you're going to be buying this because you either want balanced right now or you're going to in the future. And with those numbers that I've just quoted, it's got plenty of guts and power to drive any headphone on the planet. And I do mean any headphone on the planet. I can't think of a single headphone in the world that needs more power than the Jotunheim 2 can provide using the balanced output. Now that amount of power does cause some problems, as I'll talk about shortly, but before we do, let's talk about the various inputs and outputs of the Jotunheim 2. Starting on the front here, we've got the various selector switches. So you've got your input selector switch here that can move between the onboard card if you've used one, the XLR inputs and the RCA inputs. You've then got the gain switch, so you've got low and high gain. And finally, the next switch across is where you can choose to use the preamp output on or off. It's fantastic that the Jotunheim has this switch now, because one of the challenges with any balanced output headphone amps is that you can't use a shorting switch to turn off the preamp outputs when you plug your headphones in balanced. That works fine with single-ended, like the Asgard 3 behind me here, but it doesn't for balanced outputs. And that's where the switch is so key, because you can have your headphones plugged in all the time and choose when to output to your speakers or your power amp and when not to. So that's a great inclusion, and huge applause to Schiit for listening to consumers and implementing this switch. You'll notice the power switch is still missing from the front, it's still on the back. That's a whole other conversation, we'll get to that in a moment. Moving along the front panel still though, you've got this volume knob here. It uses a high quality outs potentiometer, it feels good to turn, and channel balance is pretty good from about the 8 o'clock position. It starts from 7 o'clock and it runs all the way around to 5 o'clock, so you've got plenty of room to move in terms of the range of the pot, but you are going to struggle with channel balance just in that first little band. Moving on from the volume pot though, we've got a 6.3mm output and an XLR 4-pin output, as well as a little indicator light that comes on white when the headphone amp's on. Now, in case you think I've skipped past more conversation around the volume control, I haven't forgotten that. I'm going to come back to it in a second and talk about the usable range of volume across a whole lot of different headphones. So just stay with me and I'll come back and talk about headphone, channel balance range, usable volume range and the like in a moment. Before we do though, I wanted to talk about the back of the amp. So on the back here, if we start at this side over here, this is where the external card would go in. So either, if you do get an external card that is, you're either going to have an RCA, a pair of RCA inputs for your phono stage, or you're going to have a USB socket for either the Delta Sigma DAC or the multi-bit DAC. As you can see, this amplifier has neither, and as I've already covered off, I'm not going to talk about the quality of those cards because I haven't reviewed them yet. Moving on from the cards, we've got the XLR inputs here for your input from your balanced amplifier. We've got the RCA inputs as well for single-ended input. We've then got preamp outs in both RCA single-ended and XLR balanced. Then we come to the dreaded power switch, which I've discussed here before. I wish it would put it on the front. These amps do draw a fair bit of current and they get quite warm. I do like to switch them off. But as Jason said in my interview with him, you can always connect them to a smart power board or smart power switch. And that's exactly what I've done while I've had this on loan from Hattie. So in the evenings, I press a button on my phone, it switches off the Jotunheim. I don't have to try to reach over and find the switch. It is a little inconvenient if you don't want to use that sort of device, but at the same time, it's a fairly minor issue. Finally, we've got the standard power connector, which means that all of your power supply is going on inside the Jotunheim 2, and that's why it weighs a fairly hefty amount. So far there's nothing groundbreaking about the Jotunheim 2. Probably the most innovative thing going on the outside is the inclusion of the preamp switch, which many other amps don't include. What makes the Jotunheim 2 a bit special though is that Schiit have put the technology they developed for their Ragnarok amplifier, which they call Nexus and Continuity, they've jammed that technology in here. Now, I don't know all the ins and outs of these. They're names for proprietary technologies that describe the topology of the amplifier and output circuits. But basically what's going on here is you're getting a very high quality circuit design in a much cheaper amplifier. The Schiit website talks about this as being the best $2,400 amplifier for under $400, and whether or not that's the case, I don't necessarily know, but what I do know is it's got technologies that previously were only available in the much more expensive and much bigger Schiit Ragnarok. So I was really excited to hear what that meant for the sound quality out of the Jotunheim 2, and I was particularly excited because it's a fully discrete design. In other words, it's not using op amps, and that in my experience means you're more likely to get a more lifelike and realistic sound with better soundstage depth and realism compared to the op amp style amplifiers like Schiit's own Magnius up here behind me that tend to flatten the soundstage a bit, and whilst they provide a nice sense of detail and width in the soundstage, often don't give the three-dimensionality and therefore the sense of realism to the music. So I came into this review really excited, looking forward to fantastic things from the Jotunheim 2. And before I tell you whether I heard fantastic things, I do want to talk about one little, maybe fly in the ointment, bump in the road, whatever you want to call it. It's relatively minor, but I think it's important to talk about. And that is the fact that there might be too much power coming out of the Jotunheim 2. And this is becoming a common theme. I talked about this with the Monolith Liquid Platinum review as well, and it's also a problem I've discovered with the Dark Voice 336 amplifier that I've got over here off camera. These headphone amps have a bit too much power and therefore don't give you a particularly good range of volume control. In the case of the Jotunheim 2, I tried it across a whole bunch of different headphones running the balanced outputs because I wanted to hear maximum sound quality, as you would too. And what I found was that you really don't get to ever go past about 11 o'clock on the dial unless you really want to be listening loud. To step through a few examples, something like the Focal Clear, I was only getting to 9:30 on the volume control. So remember, this thing runs from about 7 o'clock all the way around to about 5 o'clock. What I was getting was maybe not even a quarter turn of the volume control before I was hitting the maximum volume that I was comfortable for day-to-day listening. So the Focal Clears, as I said, I was at about 9:30. The Mesa Empyreans, I got to about 10 o'clock. The Headphone and Sundaras were around about 10, maybe a touch past 10, and the HD800S were the same. So in other words, everything I threw at this using the balanced outputs, I was never getting much past 10 o'clock on the volume control. And that to me is a shame because it does mean you're only getting a little bit past the channel imbalance area, which stops at about 8 o'clock. You're only just getting past channel imbalance when you're getting into the really usable range for day-to-day listening if you're a moderate volume listener. Now, if you like your music loud or you're listening to music that's recorded at lower levels, having all this power is fantastic. But for me, I did find I would have preferred just a little bit less gain and or a little bit less power so that I could use a bit more of the volume range. Where it really becomes an issue is that the Jotunheim 2 is definitely quiet enough that you can run sensitive IEMs. You're not going to get any hiss or any noise coming through, but the problem is you're not going to get much past, if at all, past the channel imbalance range. Using the 64 Audio U12Ts, I was only just at 8 o'clock when I felt like I was at a comfortable level. So yes, this can drive IEMs, but there's not very many that are going to be comfortable to listen to when using the Jotunheim 2. Now, of course, you can always fix this with a DAC that's got variable outputs by just pulling back a little bit on the output level. If you can do that, everything I've just said is absolutely irrelevant and you're going to thoroughly enjoy the Jotunheim 2. But if you've got a fixed output DAC like Schiit's own Bifrost 2, you may find yourself struggling to get enough range on the volume control depending on the headphones you're using and your listening levels. So that's a little bit of a wrinkle or a bump in the road for this review, but the good news is it's absolutely worth putting up with because the Jotunheim 2 sounds wonderful. It's a brilliant sounding amplifier. Starting with the balanced out, the sound from the Jotunheim 2 is punchy and rich and engaging. It's not thick, so I'm not suggesting for a second it's a thick sounding amplifier, but it's got a really excellent sense of body to it. It's an amplifier that I immediately found enjoyable, and I kept wanting to go back and plug into it and listen to more and more tunes through all different sorts of headphones. It produces a fantastic soundstage with good width and good depth, and really it's just an absolute joy to listen to. There is one little caveat here that I want to mention though. Because it does have that richer, punchier sound, it's maybe not as good of a pairing with headphones that already have a little bit of a warmer tonality to start with. And what I found was that with headphones like the Headphone and Sundara that are quite rich and quite smooth to start with, it was a little bit maybe too much of a good thing. Interestingly though, when I tried it with the Meza Empyreans, what I found was that even though they are a bit warmer and have a bit of bass emphasis to them, the resolution and the transparency of them played really nicely with the Jotunheim 2. So I think it's going to be pretty rare headphones that don't pair well with the Jotunheim 2, but there will be a few out there that start off particularly rich and warm and thick. I wonder, for example, if something like the Sennheiser HD5AX might be a little bit too thick to go with the Jotunheim 2. There might be too much similarity and it might make the headphones sound overly thick and slow. With most headphones though, this is just engaging and rich and warm. Now I want to make a big point here though before we continue. I'm not for a second suggesting that this has some kind of emphasis or bump in the bass somewhere. I think what it more comes down to is the way it's controlling the driver and the way it's presenting the audio output through to the headphones. So it's not boosting anything, it's not artificial, it's not like adding an EQ to your headphones, but it's got a character to the amplifier. I'll put that in more perspective shortly with a range of comparisons. Before I do though, continuing on the theme of what I've just been saying, it's an incredibly good match with slightly leaner sounding headphones. So essentially what I'm saying here is everything from lean through to neutral and anything with a good sense of transparency and resolution, the Jotunheim 2 is going to be thoroughly rewarding. The few headphones I don't think are going to pair so well with it though are those that start off a little bit slow and maybe a little bit thick sounding. That's where you may find it's too much of a good thing between the two. Before I talk about the single-ended output of the Jotunheim 2, I just want to mention that while testing the balanced, I also tested whether or not using the single-ended or balanced inputs made any difference. And what I found was that if there is any difference between the inputs, it's insignificant enough to not worry about. Now the reason I say insignificant enough to not worry about is because the testing process requires me to switch between inputs and at the same time switch my switching box over here. So there's a short delay between moving from one source to the other, and also I'm using slightly different interconnects. They're all high quality, but there is a slight difference, and therefore I can't confirm whether any differences I might have been hearing, and I'm not even convinced I did hear differences, but any differences I might have been hearing could have been a result of the interconnects more so than the amp itself. So the good news is, from my perspective and my experience, whether or not you want to feed balanced or single-ended into the Jotunheim 2, you're going to get equivalent performance coming out. So that's great. You can use this either with single-ended or balanced DACs and get a fantastic performance. The other question to ask though is, what if you want to use single-ended headphones? Will you be sacrificing performance instead of using the XLR output? And the good news is you're going to sacrifice maybe a little bit, but I think it's more going to be a preferential change in sound rather than a flat out drop in performance. And what I mean by that is that the single-ended output has slightly less attack on the notes. So it's not quite as clean and crisp sounding as the attack from the balanced output, but it's still very, very good. The soundstage also becomes a little bit more intimate, and that's not uncommon because often a balanced drive headphone amplifier produces slightly better channel separation than a single-ended, where you've got a shared ground wire between the left and the right channels. So there are slight differences between balanced and single-ended. There's also that drop in power that I mentioned earlier, but realistically, I would be comfortable buying this to use both outputs. I would always favour going balanced wherever possible because it just sounds so wonderful and balanced, but it's not in any way unenjoyable when using single-ended. The slight loss of attack from the edge of some of the notes may mean that that problem I talked about before with overly thick headphones could be exacerbated slightly when using the single-ended output, but that's about the only criticism I can find. In all other ways, I think the single-ended and the balance are both very enjoyable. Before I move on to my comparisons, I just want to circle back around and make sure I've been really clear here. The sound from the Schiit Jotunheim 2 is in no ways overly thick and rich. It's a punchy, engaging, and slightly warm sounding amplifier, but it's very hard for me to explain just how it does the sense of punch and weight that it does without getting overly thick and rich in a general sense. My concern is that having talked about those headphone pairings like the Sundara, where that sense of weight and punch maybe went too far with a headphone like the Sundara, I'm concerned that that might make you think that this is some rich, sludgy, thick amplifier, and it's really not. It's punchy, it's engaging, but at the top end it's got a great sense of edge to the notes, an attack on the notes, there's a good sense of detail and resolution. So for me it's doing everything right in almost all ways, with just a slight layer of punch and engagement added over the top. So hopefully that makes it really clear. This is a fantastic amplifier that by the end of this review you'll hear me highly recommending, but it's got its own character, and I think its character is wonderful. It just happens to not work perfectly with maybe 2 or 3 headphones on the market. In all other ways and with all other headphones, I think it is absolutely fantastic. So to put all that more into perspective, let's talk comparisons. I'll start with the Schiit Asgard 3. So the Asgard 3 is $199 US, making it $200 cheaper than the Jotunheim 2. It's very similar to the Jotunheim 2 though, in the sense that it's also a modular amplifier. So within Schiit's range, the Asgard 3 is the first entry-level modular amplifier like the Jotunheim 2, and then you step from the single-ended Asgard 3 up to the Jotunheim 2 if you want balanced. So there's a very logical stepping stone here, and that's why I thought it was worth comparing them. What I heard as I listened to both was that the Asgard 3 and the Jotunheim 2 share a lot of similarities in their sound. But the Asgard 3 is a little bit smoother, it doesn't have the same level of attack and resolution to the sound as the Jotunheim 2, and so you can definitely hear why you'd spend the extra $200. As a result of that extra bit of attack and resolution, what I found was that I was able to hear more texture and more detail through the Jotunheim 2 compared to the Asgard 3, and so while both have similar tonalities, I would definitely say the Jotunheim 2 is easily worth the upgrade and is the better amplifier and the better overall product. Without anything else really separating those two, the other comparison that I think is really relevant here from Schiit's own range is the Schiit Magnius. So the Magnius is also $199 US, making it the same price as the Asgard 3. It's not modular, but it is balanced. So if you're looking at Schiit's range and you're looking for the entry level for balanced amplification, the Magnius is your absolute base level, the Jotunheim 2 is your next step up. The Magnius uses an op-amp design in order to produce a headphone that is both cheap but also measures incredibly well, whereas the Jotunheim 2, as I mentioned before, is a fully discrete design using technologies that have trickled down from the Ragnarok. Both can operate as preamps, but the Jotunheim 2 is the only one of the two that has the switch for the preamp. With the Magnius, you've got an always-on preamp output that for me was a bit troublesome with my active monitors unless I wanted to switch them on and off the whole time. So the Jotunheim offers greater versatility in many ways because of the onboard card options, the switchable preamp, etc. And it's also fully discrete compared to the op-amp design in the Magnius. But what you're no doubt wondering is how do their sounds differ? Both are good products, but I'd have to say that the Jotunheim 2 sounds fantastic, whereas the Magnius just sounds very good. As I seem to continue finding every time I compare a discrete design to an op-amp design, the Jotunheim 2 produces a much better sense of three-dimensionality. It's got a better sense of layering, a better sense of space around each of the individual instruments or notes, and overall is just the better sounding headphone amp in my opinion. The Magnius does have a slightly drier sound and maybe produces a slightly better sense of texture because everything's kind of brought forward and pushed at you a little bit. It's not unenjoyable, it's not bad, it's just a different presentation, and I personally would prefer the three-dimensionality and realism that comes with that of the Jotunheim 2, but there may be some of you out there that will lean towards the Magnius, particularly given the $200 price difference. I know for me that I value both that three-dimensionality and the versatility of the preamp switch, and so I think the Jotunheim 2 is the product that I would choose, but I do understand that we've all got different use cases and different preferences. While I was playing in the $200 ballpark for the comparisons, the other thing I thought I should try was the Geshelli Erish over behind me here. I reviewed the Geshelli Erish some time ago on the channel and I was really impressed with its performance for its price. I still to this day think it's the best balanced amp for under $200, so that's basically knocking the Magnius aside by a small margin. I think it's an absolutely fantastic buy. Putting it up next to the Jotunheim 2 showed me two things. First of all, it reminded me just how good the Erish is, that it was standing up and comparing relatively well to a product worth $400 instead of its $200 price tag. So in that regard, it did fare extremely well. But where the Jotunheim 2 comfortably pulled ahead was with its sense of refinement and layering. Once again, being an op-amp design, the Geshelli Erish sounds a little bit flat in comparison and doesn't separate the layers of the music as well. The Jotunheim 2 does that pretty well. It's not the best I've heard, but it does that pretty well, and I would say exceptionally well for a $400 amp. Whilst maybe not quite as dry as the Magnius was, the Erish is still a bit drier sounding than the Jotunheim 2, and it means that things like snare hits and cymbal hits have a bit more force to them, for better or worse. I probably lean more towards the Jotunheim 2 presentation, but once again, there'll be those of you that prefer the drier and more upfront sound of something like the Erish in much the same way I discussed with the Magnius. So having come this far, it was now very, very clear to me that the Jotunheim 2 is a serious performer. It's an incredible amplifier, particularly at the price, and that got me wondering just how good it is. So of course I put it up against my reference balanced headphone amplifier in the Burson Soloist 3X. The Soloist 3X retails for just over $1,000 US, so it's a much more expensive amplifier. And I have to say that the Jotunheim 2 really held its own. It was so close for me that I think it's going to come down to a preferential choice between the two. I personally still think the Soloist is the better amplifier, but of course when you factor price into the equation, I can see a lot of people preferring the Jotunheim 2 because it then gives them more money to spend on headphones and DACs and the like. To give you an idea of what I heard and what was different, the Jotunheim 2 to me doesn't give as much textual information and detail or resolution as the Soloist does. The Soloist just pulls ahead in its sense of transparency and resolution in a way that the Jotunheim 2 can't quite keep up with. The Soloist also comes across as being more neutral because it doesn't have some of that richness and punch in the presentation that the Jotunheim 2 does so well, and this is where things get preferential. I love the presentation from the Jotunheim 2. I find it really addictive and enjoyable and engaging, but if I'm looking for ultimate accuracy, I probably do still lean to the Soloist. For example, one of the tracks I was listening to during my testing was The People and I by Benjamin Clementine. That track opens with a cello solo, and for me, the Soloist sounded like I was sitting in the room with the cello, whereas the Jotunheim 2 just smoothed the cello off a little bit and was less textural and therefore less like I was sitting right there with the instrument. Both were fantastic, and some people will say that the Jotunheim 2 has a more analog style presentation and therefore will thoroughly enjoy it. It all depends on what you're looking for out of the amp, and also what your budget is and your expectations for performance from that budget. The Jotunheim 2 also presents a slightly more intimate soundstage compared to the Soloist, which goes a little bit wider and also a little bit deeper and more spacious in the soundstage overall. But at this point, I really have to stress, we're talking $400 versus over $1,000 US. So the fact that the Soloist is outperforming the Jotunheim by a small margin goes to show just how amazing the Jotunheim 2 is. I have to say, if I was in the market for a well-performing, balanced headphone amp that was engaging and fun and fairly resolving, better than the average, that's for sure, I would go for the Jotunheim 2 every single time. The reason I would suggest somebody looks at spending just a bit more than twice as much as the Jotunheim 2 for the Soloist is if you're looking for absolute resolution and transparency. That's really the thing that separates the two of them. And that's where you've really got to ask yourself if spending more than twice as much as the Jotunheim 2 is that important for you to get the texture and the resolution and the transparency detail compared to the engagement and the fun that the Jotunheim 2 brings. To bring all this to a close, I think the Jotunheim 2, unlike the Jotunheim 1, is an absolutely stellar product. This to me is one of the best things I've heard at the price, probably ever. I can't think of another product for less than $400 US that performs as well and as impressively and makes the music as fun as it does. And I don't mean fun in some sort of novelty way. It's fun because it's being produced really well and with a character that's incredibly engaging. There are tube amps I've tried in the past that are lots of fun, but when push comes to shove, they're not quite novelty, that's going too far, but they're adding so much colour to the sound that it can get a bit old after a while. I don't think that's the case with the Jotunheim 2. I think it performs extremely well, and it just happens to have a tint of character and a tint of colour that makes it really exceptional. So if that sounds good to you, I'll put a link down below where you can read more about the Jotunheim 2 and pick up one of your own. But for now, I'll leave you to the music. Happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.